You can't defeat a narcissist on the battlefield where he feels strongest. If you argue, he'll outshout you. If you defend yourself, he'll find new accusations. If you cry, he'll call you weak. His arena is chaos, an endless swirl of emotions, word games, and manipulations, where he always stays one step ahead. But here's the twist. His greatest vulnerability is hidden in the very thing he relies on as strength. The same weapons he uses can be turned back against him. Carl Jung wrote that every person lives in a tension between what they show to the world and what they hide within. For the narcissist, that gap is enormous. On stage, he plays the role of the successful, confident achiever. But behind the curtain, he hides envy, fear, and emptiness. This is why control matters to him so much, because even the smallest crack in his performance threatens to expose the reality he dreads. And this is the key. You cannot fight a narcissist with logic, and you cannot win with raw emotion. That's like trying to fight a shadow with a sword. But when you begin to use his own methods against him, mirroring his words, cutting the conversation short, responding with cool detachment, setting firm boundaries, the equation changes. His favorite tactics become his own trap. Because the one thing he is never prepared for is to be confronted with himself. Today, we'll break down how you can defeat a narcissist using his own methods. Not to join his game, but to finally step out of it. The first method, the mirror. One of the simplest, yet most powerful methods is to reflect the narcissist's own words and behavior back to him. He's used to his phrases, his accusations, and his manipulations sliding through without resistance. He speaks, and you defend yourself. He attacks, and you explain. He devalues you, and you try to prove he's wrong. In his world, the mirror is always turned one way. You reflect his desires, you play along with his script. But the moment you shift your approach, the dynamic breaks. Imagine this. He speaks to you in a cold, dismissive tone, and you calmly reply in the same tone, "Do you hear how that sounds?" Or, "You're speaking to me the exact way you say you hate being spoken to." It's as if, for the first time, he's staring into a mirror and seeing his own shadow. Another example. He tries to accuse you of being too sensitive or of making everything into drama. Instead of defending yourself, you reflect the statement back. "You're doing exactly what you call drama right now." Or, "Interesting. You're accusing me of the very thing you do every week." In that instant, he collides with the reality he usually avoids. His own behavior is exposed, and his accusation doesn't land. The mirror is not about shouting or aggression. It's a calm technique that strips him of his favorite weapon, the ability to confuse you. Because when you don't argue and you don't explain, but simply reflect his own words back to him, he loses the stage he's so used to standing on. For him, it becomes a trap. He wanted an emotional reaction, but instead, he runs into a reflection of himself. In psychology, this is called mirroring. Jung wrote that we project onto others the very things we refuse to see in ourselves. For the narcissist, his entire life is built on such projections. And when you begin to hand them back to him, he is suddenly forced to face the shadow he works so hard to hide. And this is where he loses his footing. Because his strongest tool, accusation and control, suddenly starts working against him. The second method, silence. If the narcissist has a favorite weapon, it's silence. He uses it as a tool of control, ignoring your messages, going cold in conversation, suddenly forgetting you exist. For him, silence is a way to make you feel guilty, unwanted, and weak. You start asking yourself, what did I do wrong? Why did he shut down? How do I fix this? But the moment you flip the script everything changes. His weapon can be used against him, calmly, deliberately, not out of spite, not as revenge, but as strategy. Here's an example. He pulls his usual trick, disappearing into silence, refusing to answer a direct question, acting like you don't exist. Instead of chasing after him, you respond with silence of your own, calmly. You don't send 10 messages in a row, you don't call, you don't demand an explanation. You let the silence work for you. And for him, that's a shock. He's used to silence provoking panic, desperate attempts to win him back, a storm of emotions. But now, he sees you don't react. Another example. During an argument, he deliberately goes quiet, waiting for you to crumble under the weight of the pause, to start apologizing just to break the tension. But instead, you do nothing. You sit with the silence. You don't rush to explain. You don't fill the gap with nervous words or tears. You let the moment pass, and suddenly his trick falls flat. Instead of gaining power, he runs into emptiness. Instead of sparking your panic, he's met with calm. The key here is understanding. Silence only works when you use it consciously, not like a sulking child. This isn't about shutting down to punish him. It's about refusing to play his game. The narcissist expects a reaction, but you don't give one. He expects emotions, but you remain steady. And that unsettles him far more than shouting ever could. In psychology, this is called withdrawal of reinforcement. When someone stops getting the response they're used to, their strategy begins to collapse. In moments like these, the narcissist may panic. He might suddenly become overly sweet, try to pull you back into conversation, or even accuse you of being cold. But all of this is proof of one thing: his weapon no longer works. Carl Jung said that we come face to face with our shadow when our usual strategies no longer bring results. For the narcissist, your deliberate silence is a mirror. It shows him that his trick has lost its power. And this is where you see his method turn into his weakness. Because the silence that once scared you is now the silence that sets you free. The third method, boundaries as ultimatums. A narcissist is used to twisting your words, mocking them, or simply stepping around them. He knows that if you start explaining, defending yourself, or trying to convince him, sooner or later he'll find the weak spot and push right through. That's why real boundaries with him cannot sound like long speeches. They have to be short, firm, and final, like an ultimatum. This doesn't mean you have to shout. Quite the opposite. The power of a boundary comes from how calm, steady, and non-negotiable it sounds. For example, if you raise your voice at me, I will leave. If you explode again, I will turn off the phone. If you start insulting me, the conversation is over. The key is this: know why. No long explanations about how you feel. No detailed justifications about why his behavior hurts you. Because every explanation is a doorway, and the narcissist will always try to push through it. He'll argue, mock you, accuse you of being too sensitive, twist the meaning of your words. But if there is no door, he has nowhere to enter. Picture the scene. He launches into the usual performance: accusations, raised voice, emotional pressure. In the past, you may have tried to calm him down, insisted he misunderstood you, cried, or gone silent. But now, you simply raise your hand and say calmly, "One more word in that tone, and I'm leaving." And then you stop. You don't argue. You don't wait for excuses. You don't second-guess yourself, wondering, maybe he didn't mean it like that. The boundary has been spoken, and it holds. For the narcissist, this is a shock. He is used to stretching your words into endless arguments, turning them against you, dragging you back into the spiral. But an ultimatum, short, clear, and final, leaves him with no space to maneuver. Suddenly, he has only two options: cross the line and face the consequences, or stop. Here's the golden rule. A boundary only exists if you're prepared to follow through. If you say, "I will leave," but then you stay, you've dismantled your own strength. That's why your boundaries should always match your real capacity. Softer but unbreakable is far stronger than dramatic but hollow. A real-life example. A woman who had lived with a narcissist for years once said, "I will not continue a conversation if you start shouting." At first he laughed at her words. Then he tested her. He raised his voice, expecting her to give in. But instead of tears or explanations, she simply walked out of the room. A few minutes later, he returned speaking in a different tone, because he realized his old trick had stopped working. Carl Jung wrote that the strength of the mask rests on the illusion that it cannot be broken. But boundaries are exactly that crack. The proof that the illusion is not invincible. Every time you deliver a short, firm ultimatum, you remind both him and yourself of the same truth. You have a choice. You have strength. And from that moment on, the rules of the game begin to change. The fourth method: sarcasm and subtle deflation. A narcissist lives in a world where he is always the main character. His mask shines so brightly precisely because he demands constant confirmation of his greatness. What matters most to him is that others look up to him, admire him, fear him, respect him. In his mind, there is no room for the idea that someone could respond with irony, or worse, treat him with indifference. That's why sarcasm and subtle deflation can become such unexpected and painful tools. But they must be used carefully, sparingly, like seasoning. The goal is not to sink into cruelty, but to puncture the illusion of his grandiosity and knock him down from the pedestal he built for himself. Picture the scene. He launches into yet another monologue about how brilliant, successful, and irreplaceable he is. Normally, you might have listened, nodded along, pretended to be interested, or stayed quiet just to avoid conflict. But this time, instead of playing your usual role, you calmly reply with something like, "Yes, you do love talking about yourself." Again. Or, "Of course, you're the expert on absolutely everything." Sarcasm works like a needle against an overinflated balloon. It doesn't always cause an immediate explosion, but it disrupts the script he relies on. The script where you are supposed to feed his ego endlessly. For him, this feels like a system error. Another example. He tries to devalue you with a jab like, "Without me, you'd be nothing." In the past, that might have stung. You might have argued back, defended yourself, tried to prove him wrong. But now you shrug lightly and respond with quiet irony. "Right, of course, I can't do anything at all." And then you smile. What happens in that moment? He collides with what he fears the most. His words lose their power. He wanted to trigger pain, but instead, he got laughter. And in his worldview, that is unacceptable. Because it shatters the essence of his control. If you're laughing, you're not submitting. It's important to stress this. Sarcasm is not a war. It's a tool. If you overuse it, it can slide into constant cynicism, which ends up draining you as much as him. But when applied at the right moment, it becomes a weapon. Carl Jung wrote that the shadow always fears being seen. For the narcissist, that shadow is the terror of being small, unimportant, even ridiculous. Sarcasm is like holding up a mirror where he suddenly sees not the grand figure he imagines, but a caricature of himself. And that is his weak spot. One small detail. The most powerful way to deliver sarcasm is with a calm, almost casual tone. No anger, no tension, as if you're simply stating the obvious. That throws him off balance far more than shouting ever could. Because shouting, he expects. Sarcasm, he does not. Each time you drop a touch of irony into his great speech, or quietly deflate the drama of his manipulation, you break the mechanism he depends on, his belief in his own grandeur. And this is not just a jab, it's a reminder, to him and to you, that his power only exists as long as you treat him with the seriousness he demands. The moment you stop playing by those rules and allow yourself a drop of light irony, he loses his footing. And the calmer you are when you do it, the sharper the impact becomes. The fifth method, cold detachment. This is perhaps the most powerful method of all, because the narcissist does not live in the reality of events. He lives in the reality of reactions. What matters to him is never what he says or does, but how you respond. Your pain, your explanations, your tears, your anger, all of it is fuel. Even a negative reaction is better than none, because it confirms that he is still important, that he is still inside your emotional world. And that is why cold detachment is devastating to him. When you stop reacting, it's like you cut the power to his system. He throws out hooks, and you don't take them. He provokes, and you don't bite. He tries to sting, and you remain calm, steady, like the still surface of water. For example, he says, "You're nothing without me." In the past, you might have argued, tried to prove him wrong, listed your accomplishments, cried or gotten angry. Now you simply look at him calmly and say, "All right." And that's it. No shouting, no defense, no attempts to justify yourself. Another scenario. He plays his silent treatment game, disappearing to spark your anxiety. Before, you would have called, messaged, asked what was wrong. Now, silence on your end too. You calmly go about your day, focus on your life, continue building your world. For him, this feels like disaster. Instead of feeding on your panic, he runs into emptiness. Cold detachment does not mean anger or revenge. It is not a mask of indifference hiding a storm of emotions inside. It is a state where you genuinely stop looking for his reaction. You stop feeding the system. You stop being part of the performance. Carl Jung wrote that when a person finally faces their shadow, they are no longer its prisoner. Cold detachment is exactly that moment. You no longer fight, no longer justify, no longer beg, no longer prove. You see him as he is, without illusion, and you stop giving him the one thing he cannot exist without, your emotional fuel. That is why this method is so powerful. It rips the main tool out of his hands, the ability to control your feelings, because no matter what he does, shouts, ignores, pressures, or insults, without your reaction, it collapses into nothing, and nothing is unbearable for him. The hardest part here is holding on to your detachment in practice. Inside, you may still feel hurt, anger, the urge to prove a point. But if you learn not to engage, to hold the pause, to stay calm, that becomes a kind of armor his tactics cannot pierce. Cold detachment is the final point, the place where the game ends. Because every performance needs an audience, and you are no longer in the audience. Carl Jung wrote that the shadow stops controlling a person the moment it is brought into the light. While it remains hidden, it terrifies and enslaves. But once we begin to see it clearly and call it by its real name, the shadow loses its power. The same principle applies to life with a narcissist. His strength is not in truth, not in logic, but in the way he hides his vulnerability and forces you to react to his performance. That is why trying to defeat him with anger makes no sense. The more you argue, the more you defend yourself. The louder you shout, the more powerful he feels. But when you use the mirror, when you set firm boundaries, when you choose silence, a touch of sarcasm, and finally, Cold detachment. You do the one thing he never expects. You step out of his drama. His weapons collapse into emptiness because they no longer get the reaction they depend on. And here lies the essential truth. The real victory is not in destroying the narcissist. That is neither possible nor necessary. The real victory is in keeping yourself whole, in refusing to dissolve into someone else's will, in no longer being afraid of his words, in refusing to remain the audience to his endless play. You step out of the game. And that step alone strips him of power once and for all, because everything he held on to was built entirely on your reaction. Jung said that maturity begins when a person finally faces their shadow and stops running from it. Your methods, mirroring, boundaries, silence, detachment, are exactly the way to face the narcissist's shadow without letting it consume you. And in that moment, the story stops being about him. It becomes about you, about your strength, your freedom, and your right to live without fear.